of this conference. During yesterday and this morning, I think you have experienced a very productive and meaningful conversations. And in this session, there will be three speakers to present their experiences in climate change actions. I think we have been talking about the experiences, challenges, and also education, research. And I think in this session, we will have a chance to exchange ideas about actions. Actions is the result of knowledge and ethics. I would like to introduce the three speakers first. And they are actually also my old friends. The first speaker is Professor Harold Glaser. Harold is now teaching in West Michigan University in the United States. I knew him, I think that's about 7 years ago. Time goes very fast. 7 years ago, when I was teaching at the National Kaohsiung University in the south, in South Taiwan. At that time, I was organizing a conference for Green University for campus sustainability issues in Taiwan. And I got a chance to get some sponsorships from our National Science Council and also the Ministry of Education for the first time. I think that's the year about 2005. So I invited Professor Harold Glaser to be a speaker. And in these years, Harold has done many things in the United States and also in his university, and also for the global, I think a very influential and impressive work about campus accessibility. So today he will be talking about some key sustainability initiatives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. And the ACUPCC, the American College and University President's Climate Commitment, is a very important organization. Actually, it's a university union to fight for greenhouse gas reduction. And the second speaker is Professor Ian Thomas. Is also I knew him for several years. I also invited him to speak for us, especially about the social studies perspectives about Green University or campus accessibility. Today he will be talking about some basic ideas in learning and teaching to develop sustainability capabilities. And the third speaker is Professor Zhang Zicao. I think you must know him very well. Actually, I knew Professor Zhang much earlier than another two professors, because when I studied at Cornell University, that's about 20 years ago. I knew Zicao at that time, so he's a kind of in our culture we have a term 学长. 学长 is the elder brother for academics. At that time, I was studied in the College of Engineering, and Zicao was studying in the College of Education. And finally, about 15 years later, I went back to Taipei and to join the same institute. So now we become colleagues. And now also, Professor Zhang is now working as the Secretary General for the Environmental Protection Division in our Ministry of Education. And I'm now working for our Environmental Protection Administration. So we work in different government agencies, but working for the same thing, environmental education. And I would like to thank Professor Liu for inviting me to host this session. In the following, I think three professors will speak for 15 minutes. And after that, we will have a discussion. So let's invite Professor Harold Geiser to speak for us first.
Tremendous honor to be here and to be here with TC and I just wanted to build on a couple of the comments from the earlier session, particularly those from Milan. Okay. Professor Milan and also Eric Clark. And a couple of ideas that were raised were critical to what we do at our university and the kinds of things that I'm going to speak about. So Professor Clark raised a question, what do green and sustainability, carbon neutral concepts, what do they actually mean in practice? Fantastic questions, absolutely critical to the things we deal with every single day in our sustainability program. We'll talk a little bit about that. They're fabulous questions. I think it's important, I think Chuck also raises that this discussion is critical and consequential, not just kind of as academic research questions, but they're critical for the fate of our species. Not just the fate of Taiwan or the fate of the United States. They're the essential questions that when I give these talks, especially to presidents in the United States, is we're talking about a single question that the fate of the species is in play. And the fate of the species, not just in the sense of whether we survive or not, but it's whether we earn our imprimatur, the Latin name, Homo sapiens sapiens, man the wise wise. We are the self-proclaimed species that says we have this self-referential awareness of our own wisdom. And the question is, do we earn it? And then what I wanted to say in response to Eric is, we need to be doing this work not necessarily to guide our actions, not simply to sort of to guide our actions, but we need to think about it as not hampering us from sort of doing the right thing and from exploring the right thing. We can, as academics, oftentimes get stuck on these questions. What does green mean? What does sustainability mean? What does carbon neutral mean? And those should not be questions that stop us from doing the real world problem solving for people on the planet that we do. And then one final response to what Yolande said, which I thought was very beautiful, that our modeling and these research that we do doesn't necessarily give us the answers. What it does is it helps us to learn how to work with each other to guide options. So with that, I'll just sort of move right on. Xinqing asked me to talk a little about the ACU-PCC. So this is an effort in the United States that has 677 presidents. You can see there's a little counter there that have signed on to this commitment to become zero net carbon, the whole university. Eric's question, what does the whole university mean? And that's sort of an ongoing question. We typically use the IPCC Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions, how you calculate that, what's your system boundary, all absolutely critical questions. What my president, who's on the National Steering Committee for this organization, has said, the vast majority of the presidents that signed on to the ACU-PCC had absolutely no idea what they got themselves into. But what it did is it set the stage for faculty members and other people on campus to push this issue forward and do the modeling and explore what does it really mean. So there's a road in between. I used to be sort of more along the lines of just raising the questions that you spoke about all the time. And now I'm in a position to say, what do we do now when we raise these questions? So this is just sort of what the ACU-PCC does in the first 2 months. And I can give anyone who's interested in all the details of how this works. They have to sign on. An institution has to do something. So a very short-term incremental response. Then they have to do a GHG inventory for the whole university. So within a year, you have something to do that uses all kinds of modeling efforts. And then within 2 years, you have to come up with a climate action plan. What's the date that you're going to become zero net carbon, and how do you do it? And we did the first research, actually, looking at the first 100 ACU-PCC signatories to see what do they actually do, what do their climate action plans look like, what were the teams like, where they talking about sort of reasonable initiatives, non-reasonable initiatives. They pick a date that's totally unreasonable based upon what they were talking about doing in their report. And most of it, what we learned is that in this very early period, the first 100, most of what they did was not so good. What's coming out now is much better. And then you have to do ongoing progress reports. So it's not simply you do your GHG inventory, you do your climate action plan, and everything's done. No, there's an ongoing reporting system that I'm going to talk about. So it's an example of active social learning I spoke about earlier. All kinds of projects happening and discussions happening. And it raises issues, as an example of Allegheny College, where they're doing a switchgrass research project as an alternative fuel. So it's leading to all kinds of interesting research problems. There's a whole series of publications that have been put together to support the meaningful responses on the campuses. And you can get those from the ACUPCC website. And then they created a database where people have to report. So you have to sign on to the ACUPCC. Well, you have to show what you're doing in these first few months. You have to show your GHG inventory. You have to show your climate action plan. And you have to provide ongoing information for updating that. So it's turned out as a social learning experiment. I was originally quite negative and had all kinds of arguments. I argued that we should be going for carbon neutrality. Interesting enough, the kinds of issues that Eric is raising. I said what we first should do is create a system which you do your GHG inventory and you commit right away a yearly reduction from there so that there will be direct and meaningful accountability, not a goal in the future, 50, 20, 30 years down the line for becoming zero net carbon, but short-term meaningful incremental response. And I lost that battle, so Eric, so interesting how it all plays out. Here's a few of the overview of the quick achievements. 677 signatories now, 12,000 individuals working to implement ACUPCC. 6 million students are part of the institutions that have signed on. 1,583 greenhouse gas emissions inventory, so multiple ones have been submitted. 465 climate action plans, but you'll note that there's only 395 unique ones. So not all of the 677 that have signed on have yet to produce their climate action plan. And then this is a little bit about what's done. One of the interesting requirements that relates to climate action plan is not just focused on GHG emissions. It's focused on introducing not climate change, but climate neutrality education for the whole university. Climate neutral education, not just climate change. The assumption is there's no conversation anymore about whether climate change is happening. We have to have discussions in classes that talk about becoming climate neutral on campus. And sustainability is also built into that. And then here's just a little bit of information kind of on the upshot. The average GHG emissions, this is stuff I put together in terms of higher education institutions in the US is 121 million metric tons carbon equivalent. It's 2% of the US annual emissions. ACUPCC signatories represent 30% of U.S. enrollment. So if all these universities became zero net carbon, it's a reduction of about 0.7% of the whole U.S. carbon budget. So is that significant? Insignificant? You have to decide. What Michael Crow, who's the president of Arizona State University, has said, maybe this seems insignificant, but it's 100% of the carbon footprint of all those people that are in college. It's what Chuck talked about yesterday. These are the people that end up being, in many cases, the movers and shakers in terms of policy change in the United States. So 100% of the carbon footprint is higher ed, and 30% now of the people who go on are in universities that are focusing on becoming zero net carbon. So then, this is all separate from the behavior change that happens as a result of people being engaged in this effort to become zero net carbon. So that's a critical point. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our efforts, our 17-year history of conservation and how this relates to the ACUPCC. We increased building space on campus by 19% and reduced energy use by 17%. How is this done? A lot of it has to do with the 87% reduction of our CO2 emissions from our power plant going from coal to natural gas. And we have a cogen, one of the most efficient power plants of all higher ed in the US. 50% reduction of water consumption at the same time. And then 76% of existing buildings have been modified to address energy conservation. 14 new buildings focusing on LEED principles, and I'll talk more about another building that we're working on So that's our GHG inventory, and this is what our climate action plan looks like. Unlike many of the universities, we set a date that's fairly far out, 2065. So this has to do with reductions in different forms of those GHG emissions. The colors match. This on the bottom is offsets, and we have a non-offset policy. So most of the universities that have reached carbon neutrality have all focused on offsets. We have a non-offset policy, although a very small amount that's for air travel. There are a couple of other things I can talk about if anyone wishes. So, Chin also asked me to talk about another project that I'm working on. It's a project from an organization called the Sustainable Endowments Institute in Cambridge, which I work with very closely. It's called the $1 Billion Green Challenge. And it's addressing funding mechanisms to support doing this research on campus when you don't necessarily have government funding to support it. So, what does this program look like? It was launched in 2011 at the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Ed meeting in December. And this is the founding group. I'm in there somewhere. 42 institutions now. In that time, I think there were 17 or 18 institutions originally. And $88 million has been committed into this effort. So what does it look like? A report came out. You can get all this available online. Reading the bottom line, in 2011, it looked at using these green revolving funds to support especially conservation initiatives, so energy, water, other resources. That's us. We're actually at the top of that list as having the highest internal rate of return on projects. A whole series of different case studies. They're all downloadable. I think that one is us too. They put together an investment primer, so they create the materials to help colleges and universities be able to do this work. And then similarly, there's a database called GRITS, which we worked very closely to create. And that's in process now, not available yet, but soon it will be available. And the cool thing about the GRITS database is anytime you do a project, you put it on the database. So now you get all this information. A college that's done a lighting retrofit. Well, how much does that cost? You're thinking about doing one on your campus, and you can see that data and cross-reference. So this is a really fabulous project that I think could have great merited benefit for doing in Taiwan. So these are the sources of capital that are outlined: administrative budgets in your college and university, gifts or grants, student sources, that's one that we've used well too, and endowment investment. And then these are the kinds of things that we've done: external grants, again the student sustainability fee, which I've spoken about, that. Something called a quasi-green revolving fund. So we have the oldest one of these in the country, and this was our university, our Vice President of Business and Finance said, our budgets for utilities and our budgets for deferred maintenance, all of those should be available for these kinds of projects, because we would rather not pay for those hard energy costs if we could find a way to not need them. And that's what led to the power plant changes we were talking about earlier. And then the $1 Billion Green Challenge, which I'll talk about in a second. This is some of the behavioral change research that we are doing. A PhD student of mine is looking at the role of electricity dashboards on behavior change in buildings. Then the question is, what's the relationship between providing that information and that leading to a change in action? So then what's the role of structured programming in that building and further making changes? And this is what the study looks like. It's in 22 buildings on campus: research buildings, administration buildings, classroom buildings, funded by a $300,000 grant from Honeywell. And then this is another project funded by the DOE. We have the largest electric vehicle infrastructure of any campus in the U.S. That's a big solar array that goes with that. And then these are the things we do at battery electric vehicle, couple PV, university vehicles, so people see those driving around. And then incentives for the university and people in the community. So you'll see Teslas. This is actually our array. So people with Teslas parked there, multiple ones. And then I get called by students, parents who are leasing a Leaf, so her daughter can drive back and forth to school about 25 miles from campus. And then these are some of the projects that students do. We actually do transportation research using cargo bikes instead of those vans to move materials around. Working on bikes. This is a project that takes the waste oil from dining services, and we do a super filtration process. So we don't make biodiesel, don't use methanol. Much more efficient, much better from a life cycle standpoint, and we run it directly in vehicles on campus like lawnmowers. This is a research project which I don't have time to talk about, but it's super cool, with how to improve recycling behavior on campus. And then here one's sort of talking, this is a student farm, but this is the head of catering, and he's working in our student farm. So this is sort of the social learning experiment. So the head of catering is working in the student farm, This is students standing in front of different buildings where they've grown herbs in the winter in the greenhouse. And this is a political science professor who works on development research who they're giving the herbs they grew to. This is them they use the food to create this student-run cafe initiative, but they don't have the cafe yet, so they're creating these special meals where they invite people from the university community to come. That's the president's wife at one of their farmers markets. And this is just a little bowl of food. You know, what does that little bowl of food actually convey? When you look at it from a systems dynamics, systems thinking process, that's what we do. And then just a quick facts about sort of the quasi-GRF idea. This is what we talked about the campus growing so fast, but still having an energy reduction. And to talk about it in the context of how that affects you and your relationship to the federal government, 47% internal rate of return and $17.35 million has been saved. So what kind of other projects could that fund on campus? This is the spreadsheet, so we really actually did track that data. And then this is just a quick discussion on what we've done in terms of the $1 billion green fund. So we have that quasi-green fund, but this is what we've done for our $1 billion green fund. So with a little bit of help from our Vice President for Business and Finance, she gave me $1 million to fund this project. So we fund for 4 years, $250,000 goes to a project which we collaborate with our facilities division to still invest in the most high internal rate of return projects. And you'll see what happens at it. So out of doing this, at the end of that 4 years, there's $468,000 US. I now have a stream that's been pulled from our utilities budget. For every year, $470,000 it's being used for energy conservation and renewable energy projects around campus. So I'm going to end with something called the Living Building Challenge. So Dream Big. This is a project which we're working on right now to build the greenest building in higher education. But this building takes into account all the kinds of things that Eric was talking about. So site, water, energy, health, materials, equity, and beauty. Talk about kind of complex, deep attributes that are tremendously meaningful. What does it mean to have a conversation about a building that's beautiful? These indicators are all go, no-go gauges. So you can't do this and not do equity. The only way you achieve Living Building Challenge is if you do all of these things. And the kinds of social learning that's involved in working with engineers and architects and designers in the university community is incredible. These are the companies, some of the companies that put in RFQ proposals to work with us. This is Bob Berkebile. This is a building that doesn't actually exist, so it shows you how good designers are. This is a building that does exist, one of the few in the United States and the world that's ever achieved the Living Building Challenge. So that's the zero net water, zero net energy. This is another building that does exist in Brooklyn, in New York. And this is a building that relates to what Chuck was talking about a friend of mine, John Robinson from UBC. This is his building in Vancouver. So just end with our model again, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Harold Glaser. And the next speaker is Professor Ian Thomas. Professor Thomas is now teaching in the RMIT Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology in Australia. He has been involved in EFS, that's Education for Sustainability, actually curriculum reform activities at the university and also in Australia. Let's welcome Professor Ian Thomas.
Thank you as well. Can everyone hear me well? Is that okay? Okay. Thank you once again for the very generous introduction. And I also thank very much the technical support we have here, because just as the introduction finishes, everything works, so very well done. I think this morning we've really heard a wonderful outline of the challenges that we have. Challenges for us as being academics, but also people working in tertiary institutions generally. And particularly I think with Professor like to do to follow that up a little bit is to look at some of the ways in which we might need to think about how to accept that challenge to bring about the sorts of changes for carbon neutrality and climate change education generally, and what we might be able to do within the universities. So I particularly just want to touch on some basics, mainly factors that are going to be important, because essentially I start with the question of why is it taking us so long to implement the curriculum change, to bring in all these sorts of ideas in the universities. And essentially, I think the issue is that it's related to the complexity, again, of what we're trying to do. There's no single way of bringing about this sort of change. There is no one example that we can give to anyone to say, this is the way to achieve the sorts of outcomes we're looking for. It's much more complicated and complex than that. So I just today wanted to touch on the several factors which seem to be some of the major ones which are going to be important in us bringing about the sorts of change that we're going to need. So I want to touch on 7 important and interconnected factors as well. And this in a sense is, I suppose, an example of some of the models that were being talked about in the previous session, the complexity of the modelling, and also just what perhaps we can think of in terms of some models and the connections of the factors in them. One factor, first factor, is probably important, and one of the more important ones that start our change, is to think about the organisational change. The changes that are needed in our institution, in all the parts of the institution, the people, the systems and structures of that institution. So essentially the changes that need to be made in the university. Looking at the way in which change can be seen to be needed. So just recognising that there needs to be some change. So for example, the signing of one of the many declarations that universities are involved in, such as the Talwar Declaration. Just simply the organisation agreeing to sign that says, okay, we are recognising there's going to be a need for change. But then, once we've done that, we need to bring in the change. And of course, that's very complicated in large organisations. So to bring in that change, we need to have Okay? Yeah. So to bring in that change, we're going to need to have all the staff understanding why the change is needed. Right, we signed the Talwar Declaration, fine, but really, what's the importance of that? What does it lead on to? So a collective understanding, but also understanding not just why we need to change and what we're trying to achieve, but also understanding the change process. So very much around that idea of social learning, organisational learning, all the ways in which the organisation and people need to be brought in for that change process. And then, of course, there's the implementation of the change itself, really moving on, looking at the way, in particular, the culture of the organisation. In other words, the ideas that we all have that relate to our disciplines, to our program areas, to our departments, all those parts, which again need to be thinking about how they change to a culture where sustainability issues, climate change are the important things that we need to focus on. So organisational change, for one thing. The second thing then is thinking about those ways in which the organisation begins to change through the development of institutional strategies. So essentially the creation of those sustainability plans that the university and the curriculum uses to bring about the change. But particularly also the importance of not just having a plan for the sake of a plan. It needs to be a plan which is going to involve actively the executive of the organisation. So to have all the top managers and important people in the organisation committed to that plan. But also probably that those people are going to have to recognise the opportunities and challenges that come from the university having that plan and connecting their plan to external influences, such as the Talwar Declaration. Talwar Declaration, an external influence, and a wonderful guide for the sorts of things that happen in the institution, and many other guides as well externally. The third factor that I'd like to bring in and talk about is the very complicated area
of academic development. So essentially the education for the faculty, for the academics in the institution.